Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saeeduddin Faridi. I'm a research analyst here, and I will be your host for today's episode, which looks at the power sector in Pakistan. The criticality of stable and adequate supply of electricity cannot be overstated in the context of socio-economic development. And in developing countries, the reliable delivery of cost-effective power can be a challenge. This can be demonstrably seen in Pakistan. The country's power sector has historically faced many challenges, including frequent power outages, transmission and distribution losses, high subsidies, and limited infrastructure. At the same time, the sector has also gone through multiple reforms, characterized by allowing private participation, setting up of regulatory bodies, and setting up of newer companies for generation, transmission, and distribution. These reforms have not always taken the route they intended, and increasingly, some issues have become aggravated. More recently, newer developments have emerged. The Belt and Road Initiative and the global push towards energy transition have impacted the energy landscape in Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is amongst the most important components of the BRI, brought significant foreign investment into Pakistan's power sector. At the same time, there is an ongoing push towards deploying more and more renewable energy while phasing out fossil fuel-based energy sources. And Pakistan is also undertaking these energy transitions, and it plans to increase the share of its renewable energy in its energy mix from 30% currently to 60% by 2030. And so these developments are likely to have important consequences for the sector. And to help us understand these persistent problems within Pakistan's energy sector and the emerging landscape, we are joined today by Dr. Ijlal Naqvi, Associate Professor of Sociology, School of Social Sciences at the Singapore Management University, and the author of the book Access to Power, Electricity, and the Infrastructural State in Pakistan, published by the Oxford University Press. Dr. Naqvi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Saeed. Look forward to talking to you.
So I want to start off with a question which can give us some context for our conversation. So to help us navigate the issues in the power sector in Pakistan, could you talk us through the issues that have contributed to the power crisis in Pakistan? Is it a problem of supply, structural challenges, or policy, or all of the above and more?
I'm afraid it's all of the above and more, which makes it very difficult to give you a sort of tight and quick response. One of the things you mentioned in your introduction was that developing countries rely on a adequate and cost-effective supply of energy in their economy to make the economy work. And it's a huge social and economic issue. So there's never been a point in Pakistan's history when the Pakistani government hasn't been aware of it. In every 5-year plan, going back to the foundation of APTA and even before, electricity has been sort of at the top of the agenda. You know, you can see this as a mid-20th century issue and continuing through later. The Pakistan government has always tried to address the power sector and seen the power sector as central to the success of the country or the potential success of the country. So when you ask, is the current power crisis in Pakistan, a combination of these various factors, it's true. But I want to add one more thing, which is that it's a governance problem, because in many respects, the problems are well known and they've been identified for a long time. These things you've said about particularly the cost of producing power, the excessive subsidies that exist in the system, and transmission and distribution losses, which is when electricity is supplied into the system, but not even billed. So there's a separate category, which is that people don't pay their bills and you have running defaulters. But there's a substantial amount of electricity which is never even billed to consumers. Historically, it's been closer to 25%. These days, the losses are down below 20% to something like 17%. But this means that paying consumers effectively have to pay for others who take from the grid without paying their own way. So all of these things combined set up a substantial set of problems. There's a turning point really in the mid 1990s when the 1994 power policy is introduced. This was largely driven or enabled and supported really by the World Bank and USAID, among others. There was a lot of international lending that went chiefly to independent power producers, the IPPs. These have been a big presence in Pakistan ever since. And they, in short, they did a couple of things. One was that they increased the cost of providing power. Yes, they increased the total power supply, but it was more expensive. It was also substantially through imported fossil fuels. At the time, this was largely high sulfur furnace oil, which is environmentally filthy as well as being subject to the vagaries of international energy markets. So as this happened, Pakistan was put into a situation which has some parallels to today. Basically, too much power, a reliance on imported fuels and fossil fuels at that. This was part of a larger privatization strategy, which only ever took place in a piecemeal manner. Part of this strategy that was clearly identified at the time was that the distribution companies, which provide electricity to paying consumers, had to become commercially viable, meaning that essentially they had to cover the costs of generation with the revenues that they earned. By never addressing transmission and distribution losses to a sufficient degree, this process was never achieved. But the rest of the reforms pushed ahead, which meant that this expensive and substantial amount of power was introduced, and that too without competitive bidding. So this meant that a country whose power sector has previously relied on a domestic source, domestic gas, had become now dependent on imported fuels, and the fuel prices move with energy markets, and you can see over the decades of Pakistan's power sector history, spikes in the energy market will quickly ripple through into the economy because of the exposure of the federal government to the power sector. Basically, when it was domestic gas powering the power plants of the country, the country was insulated in a way from these price spikes. But what has happened is that between the electricity losses, which despite declining remain substantial, you have other subsidies and fiscal transfers that take place, for which the federal budget is the ultimate safeguard. And this means that there are ways in which the provinces are integrated into a single national grid. The national grid functions, I mean, it's more than a metaphor for nation building or state building. I mean, this really is how the country was done, how the country was built. And you can see WAPDA is the Water and Power Development Authority. It used to be the integrated electric utility as well as the sort of water management. But the early rhetoric around WAPDA was that they were powering a new nation. And as the expansion to electrification was carried out across the country, this was very much the idea that a new and hopefully more modern nation was being built. And the integration into the national grid of the various areas of the country, it came as basically a set of compromises that had to be offset with what are in effect subsidies or fiscal transfers of a different sort. I mean, the AJK, which is Pakistani Kashmir, for example, takes a subsidized rate, which has its own historical origins due to a dam construction from an earlier era. In Balochistan, you have tube wells that are subsidized as a way of effectively co-opting large landowners into sort of acquiescence with a national grid. And all of these relationships, they have at their heart the relationship of the federal center to the provinces. And the center, the state, has little ability to command payments. And at the heart of this are sort of electricity costs. And the more these become burdensome to the average citizen, to the average electricity consumer, the more tension there is and challenge, which not only comes to bear on the federal budget. Do you provide a subsidy to sort of save the political government from the dangers of people getting upset and coming out to protest, which they do when electricity prices come too high? Or do you try and pass on the costs so that you can manage to balance the budget of the power sector? So all this has been exacerbated by a few other things, such as the industries that Pakistan did build up, particularly in textiles and cement, are not only a low share of overall consumption of electricity, but they tend to be energy intensive. And since at least 2017, the government has been essentially printing money to pay government bills. This has led to currency devaluation. Currency devaluation feeds directly to this reliance on imported fuels, which means that fuel prices get more and more expensive. Um, it's a horrible set of problems. It's not the first time that Pakistan has faced some set of these. The best with this sort of arrangement, the best that happens is that lower costs in the international energy market make the subsidies more affordable. But this is not a sustainable, manageable scenario in the long run, and crises such as the current one clearly illustrate this.
Thank you for that really comprehensive answer. I think you covered a lot there. And I want to come back to one of the things you said, which was the issue of too much power. So, for some time now, Pakistan has faced this issue where generating capacity exceeds domestic demand for electricity. And even with CPEC, which brought in a lot of investments, we saw the development of many power projects. And despite this, the issue of power outages and electricity not reaching everyone, it continues. So, how do you see this challenge being mitigated, and what steps is the government currently taking to deal with this crisis?
So it's a really difficult question to think about how the challenge can be mitigated, and the government's taking several steps towards this. But there's a really strange problem that Pakistan has in that it can't afford the electricity that it produces. That's what load shedding is. Load shedding, sort of rolling blackouts, whereby different areas are basically not supplied electricity. It's a rationing that happens, and the reason Pakistan experiences load shedding is, as the question demonstrates, is not because they can't generate enough power. It's just that they can't afford to pay for the power that they could generate. And this is so obviously damaging. It's the irony being that load shedding constrains both, sort of social and economic well-being, prevents the economy from growing. But they have to do it in order to lessen the burden of the cost of running the power sector. So escaping that knot is the challenge that no one has yet managed to solve for Pakistan. So there's a couple of things that the government has proposed. I'll run through a few of them. One is that they want to privatize some of the distribution companies. And the ones that have been mentioned are the ones basically in the northern Punjab. And that is, in my opinion, an utterly pointless exercise because these are essentially distribution companies that function at a very reasonable rate. Their electricity losses are sort of in the region of 10%. It is that low precisely because these are highly industrialized areas or the areas with the most concentration of industry. And so if you sort of privatize these, it would not help because so much of the high loss areas are basically elsewhere. And even so, there hasn't been any success in attempting to privatize these distribution companies anyway. This is more 2023 than now, there was a big push to improve losses. And this was done with sort of task force teams that integrated some security forces into basically efforts to pressurize consumers to pay their bills. I'm not sure of the state of that, but the long run performance on losses has actually been improving. Another effort that took a lot of press recently, but I think this was something that attracted political attention because they were easy targets, which was that some of the independent power producers were being squeezed to kind of cut their margins. But the ones that it was possible to squeeze were effectively only a small fraction of the overall cost. So even though they made for easy targets, the public perception is that these folks have made excess profits, and there may be some truth to that. That's something that power sector people talk about. The largest proportion, I think it's some 75% altogether, of these independent power producers. Some, I mean, ironically, that they're independent power producers, but they're actually government run by the provincial governments, and others are from CPEC. And for these, their contracts are not so negotiable. The government's not effectively saving any money by changing those contracts or challenging the contracts with Chinese entities would be very problematic on multiple levels. And so this leaves the ultimate answer for this, the usual answer, which is to raise revenues from consumers, to raise prices for ordinary electricity consumers. And that would be extremely challenging and politically dangerous.
I do want to come to this point of how reforms can have these political consequences because Pakistan has just received a $7 billion extended fund facility. This is part of the longer chain of IMF loans that Pakistan has had to rely on in the past. And they tend to be tied to a demand for structural reforms in the economic sector. So, and especially with regard to subsidies. So, and removing subsidies is naturally a very can be a costly political move. So, how do you see the Pakistan government carrying this such a policy out, and how will the Shahbaz Sharif government negotiate this situation?
Frankly speaking, this is the same thing that has been proposed by the IMF and other multilateral and bilateral development actors for a long time. Um, it's not necessarily opposed on a principled basis among the sort of bureaucracy and political leadership, but what they are aware of, especially among the politicians, is how likely there would be a backlash. Pakistanis have a history of protesting over power bills. They've done it in the past. I would certainly expect it to happen again if there was some substantial way in which power prices were increased. What we most recently saw was that actually the Punjab government made an effort to reduce costs for their own, the Punjabi consumers. And what this did was sort of exacerbate tensions across the country. It was seen as a favoritism towards the Punjab. And I think there's another way that you have to understand sort of the regulation that takes place. And the goals that there are. On the one hand, it's about sort of keeping costs down, costs of service provision down to those that are exist in the most competitive areas. But there's another action that's happening here, which is one of inclusion. And there is an explicit goal of including everyone across the country and serving them at the same electricity tariffs, at the same rates, giving them the same cost of production. And this is particularly sensitive because many of the domestic sources of electricity are found in regions that are otherwise considered neglected and have seen themselves taken advantage of, or at least certainly that's their argument, taken advantage of by the Punjab. So this would be politically extremely sensitive. I don't expect the Shahbaz Sharif government to do it. In that sense, they're the same as every other government. And if they did, I would expect there to be a backlash from which it could certainly destabilize the government. And this is all exacerbated by the current position of Pakistan's government, which has an extremely compromised legitimacy because of the obvious interference of the military at multiple levels. This isn't the first time this has happened in Pakistan, but it's somewhat extreme at the moment. The country's most popular political party, the PTI, is being excluded from government, and there's constitutional reengineering taking place to try and ensure that the military can influence the executive, and through the executive, the judiciary, to be able to ensure its own position beyond challenge. But the cost of that is both the legitimacy of democratic governance in the country, as well as ways in which government is set up to be effective, undermines the constitutional order of the country. So there's a lot that's going on there, and this is an especially bad moment to attempt something so manifestly unpopular.
I think you raised some very interesting points there, and it will remain to be seen how something like this unfolds. But I want to move to come to the element of energy transition now. And we see that government data now indicates that Pakistan's energy basket is transitioning to a mix of hydropower, nuclear, and renewable sources. So, what is the status of transition to renewable energy, and how do you see it growing?
So I think the idea of a transition to renewable energy is both appealing and perhaps somewhat seductive, but it's easy to get trapped into it. I would say that if you take a more historical look at planning in the Pakistani power sector, you see what the actual increase in the power sector has been year on year versus projected increases. You see a big gap. Plans invariably underperform. And the safe bet is that we continue to consume oil and gas for our power generation. And at this point in time, Pakistan consumes more oil and gas in energy production than it ever has before. So in the projections about increasing renewables, hydropower is a big, big portion of this. So due to the mountainous areas and the rivers in the country, there's always been seen a large potential for hydropower. I already mentioned the provincial tensions that exist both within the country generally and that are specific to the power sector. And so hydroelectric power is a great illustration of this. These projects are hugely controversial due to provincial rivalries, and they have been delayed for many, many years. We've seen the same names again and again, like Daimir Basha and Kalabag, right? And so you can put them on a plan, but that doesn't mean that they're going to happen any more than they've been happening for the past 20 years. When they are delivered, these projects are invariably delivered late and massively over budget. Neelam Jhelum is a classic example of this. It's sort of in 1989, I think people are talking seriously about it with a cost of $165 million. In 2011, they were talking about it with a cost of $2.35 billion. You know, it's eventually commissioned in 2018. It was supposed to be built in sort of the early aughts, 2002 to 2008. It was delayed. There was an earthquake in 2005 in Kashmir. These things are invariably delayed. And I mentioned the earthquake specifically because this is the seismic zone. And Daimir Basha is one that has been specifically identified as having a special danger from the potential for earthquakes. So I would not rely on the hydroelectric projections at all. Secondly, within that, you mentioned nuclear. Chashma 5 is the key project here. It's painfully expensive at $4 billion. Planners who look at the least cost path will say that this is to be avoided. I would agree. So you're already looking at hydro and nuclear where the projections are unlikely to be realized. The grid solar that's going to be added or projected to be added is somewhat small. Same with wind, although I think wind, just seeing from the wind corridor that continues into the Indian coastline that neighbors Pakistan, you see that there's tremendous potential there. But I think it's distributed solar that we really want to talk about here, because that was the wild card. It doesn't actually appear in government plans. So that's the irony, is that the single largest growth in renewable capacity is not part, the way it's happening is not part of the government's plans. I think that's a very interesting environment there.
That is actually what I wanted to draw on for our last question, because there is this recent uptick in Pakistan in solar power, not at a grid level, but at a household. I mean, where we've seen solar panels being installed in households and in farms, and this experience sort of is quite divergent from other developing countries, such as India, where we've seen huge installations of solar parks and grid scale solar power. So how do you look at Pakistan's experience in this domain, and what is the potential for this?
So I think there's huge potential for distributed solar in Pakistan. When I was last in Lahore, which was December 2023, I rode the monorail, which is elevated and therefore gives you a little bit of a perspective on the city. And as you go by, you see just solar panels everywhere. It's really proliferated, and that was in December 2023. It's even more since then. The total grid's installed capacity is about 45 gigawatts, and the import of private solar panels from China is about 13 gigawatts, which is incredible. And this is completely consistent with standard practice in Pakistan, by which I mean Pakistanis don't rely on public goods provision. And this is true of wealthy Pakistanis, it's true of poor Pakistanis as well, that whenever possible, for example, if you want clean water, you're not relying on tapped water. If you want good schooling for your kid, chances are that people are going to private schools. Transport, people rely on private transport rather than public in many respects. And even security. People have, private security at shopping malls, at complexes, at restaurants, and in their homes. as well. None of this is good, but it represents a manifest failure of the state to effectively provide public goods. And for electricity to come within the same ambit is entirely predictable and consistent with how Pakistanis act in other areas. So the more that small-scale household batteries are available at a cost-effective price, it would only accelerate this path. Um, Currently, what happens is that if you have a net metering connection, which is admittedly a small proportion of all the sort of solar arrangements that people have, you basically use the grid as storage because you sell back to the grid. So there is an issue there with the pricing, whether it's net metering versus gross metering. The government, I think, would like to see the feed-in tariff reduced. Um, but although that was heavily discussed about 5, 6 months ago, no action was taken, to my knowledge. The problem is that all of this distributed solar in its current format compromises the integrity of the grid, which relies on scale for its efficiencies. But I mean, it's so inefficiently operated that this expansion of private solar, in effect, has a public consequence, which is quite damaging for the grid. But at a private level for individuals, and especially for individuals who might be marginalized in other ways, this is exactly on an individual basis what people will be doing to address their power generation problems. They're already doing this with sort of UPS systems and diesel generators, and solar power seems like just a far more effective way to do it. So I expect this to continue and to expand.
Thank you for that very interesting perspective that you gave on solar power because of this lack of reliance on public service delivery, which is now also permeating into the power sector with solar capacity being installed on rooftops in homes. And also thank you for this very insightful conversation. I think we were able to draw from a lot of perspectives for quite an insightful discussion. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Saeed. It was a pleasure talking to you.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on our research and publications through social media. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.